Dr. William W. Freehling is surely one of the most distinguished scholars specializing in 19th century American history, with a special emphasis on the South and the Civil War era. He currently serves as the Singletary Professor of Humanities Emeritus at the University of Kentucky and Senior Fellow for the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. He grew up in Chicago, received his undergraduate degree at Harvard, where incidentally he wrote his honors thesis under the late Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He earned his master's and doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley, and he has taught at both Harvard and Berkeley, as well as the University of Michigan and Johns Hopkins. He's the author and editor of 7 books of history and a winner of the Owsley Prize and the Bancroft Prize, his profession's highest award of recognition. His books include Prelude to Civil War, The Nullification Controversy in South Carolina, Secession Debated, Georgia's Showdown in 1860, The Reintegration of American History, Slavery and the Civil War, The South versus the South, How Anti-Confederate Southerners Shaped the Course of the Civil War, and The Road to Disunion, his critically acclaimed 2 volumes tracing the complex story of how and why the North and the South went to war. In Volume 1, Secessionists at Bay, which was published in 1990, Dr. Freehling looked at the history of the antebellum South from the time of the American Revolution to 1854. His book treated not just the great historical movements, such as slavery, but examined in detail the social fabric of the South and individual Southerners. In his 2nd volume, Secessionists Triumphant, which has just been published, he moves the story forward to the outbreak of war in 1861, and he shows us, with considerable original research and perspective, first, that the South was hardly a monolithic land filled only by slaveholders, and second, how an extraordinarily aggressive white minority managed to widen the breach between the ideals of democracy and the reality of slavery to the point of war. His book is compelling, his argument is provocative, and we are delighted to welcome the author with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William W. Freehling.
It's always wonderful to get applause before you start, but the best part is to get some applause when you end. I'll try to. I'm so happy to be here, and especially because this is Bill Starr's baby. And Bill Starr has been involved in 2 careers that are very, very important to writers. First of all, he was editor for many years of the book review section of the Columbia Star and did a wonderful job in that capacity. But now, book review editors are disappearing right and left. It's very, very rare that serious books are reviewed in the public prints. I understand that the Atlanta paper has just lost its book review editor. And with that happening, it becomes all the more important to have forums like this one where you can reach out and touch the public in a way that's no longer possible in newspapers. So thank God for Bill Starr, and I was so delighted to have his invitation to come today. Whenever I lecture to my class, I always say, I don't really like to lecture. I much prefer to discuss things. And any time you wish to question what I'm saying or object to what I'm saying or anything about what goes on during the lecture period, please raise your hand, and I don't mind being interrupted a bit. And then we'll have a question period afterwards. And to facilitate those questions, let me very briefly sketch what both my volumes were about, and particularly what the 2nd volume is about, and then I'll get to the main deal. And the main deal for me, as I suspect for most of you, is how in the world did the South ever secede, since most Southerners wanted no part of secession? That's a great question and a great story, and I'll get to it in just a second. Except to tell you that as I tried to answer that question back when I started this book, believe it or not, back in 1967, and studied just the secession crisis, just the period after Lincoln's election, tried to figure out why the South seceded. I couldn't do it. There were just too many problems. It made no sense to me, particularly in view of what I'd been taught about the South. So I was driven back and back and back in order to try to figure out secession. And I finally ended up back in 1776. And I started my story of secession in 1776 and marched forward to 1854 with my first volume, which was published in 1990. And then, for the past years, in addition to teaching and writing other books, I've been working on the second volume of The Road to Disunion, which covers the years 1854 to 1861, and that book was published 5 weeks ago. That book starts with the bloody Kansas affair after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It includes a long discussion of the pro-slavery argument, which is an intriguing argument, simply because most Southerners had a lot of trouble justifying slavery, particularly in view of the obvious evils of slavery, and especially the breaking up of families, which bothered the slaveholders too. It was very difficult to defend this institution. Southerners went through all kinds of intellectual gymnastics trying to defend it, and I trace that story. I think it's a terrific story. And then I talk about the Dred Scott decision. I talk about a movement that most of you have never heard of, but which is just fascinating, a Southern attempt to reopen the African slave trade in the late 1850s. And then I talk about an even more startling Southern crusade to re-enslave the free blacks in the period right before the Civil War. South always said that every black had to be enslaved. Well, if every black had to be enslaved, why were there 250,000 free blacks, as indeed there were in the South, as many free blacks as were in the North? That became a real issue in the late 1850s, and the Southerners tried to reverse history and re-enslave free blacks. Fascinating story. I move on to talking about John Brown and his famous raid. And then finally, after all these years, I'm up to the election of 1860, which takes me 4 chapters to cover, and to get Lincoln elected. And once Lincoln is elected, I'm ready for the grand finale that I've spent 27 years preparing for, how in the world the South seceded, particularly in view of the tremendous opposition to secession in the South. And I've come to think of this as an extremely important story, not just to figure out the Civil War, but to understand how powerful minorities are, and to understand that democracy, which is supposed to be the rule by the majority, is so often the rule by an aggressive minority that knows what it wants and goes out and gets it and pushes around a majority that is a pretty silent affair. So this is the story of how in the world a very powerful Southern minority secured something, secession, and ultimately Civil War, and ultimately one of the greatest tragedies in our history, even though most Southerners wanted no part of it. When I estimate how many Southerners wanted no part of secession, on the day after Lincoln's election, Lincoln's elected on November 6th, 1860, as most of you know. And on November 7th, 1860, my own estimation is that 85% of Southern voters wanted no part of secession at that moment. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll see how those numbers mounted. First of all, in the upper South, the 8 southern states above the Cotton South, above Georgia and so on, and I mean states like Virginia and Arkansas and North Carolina and Tennessee and Maryland and Missouri and Kentucky and Delaware, those 8 states, they never seceded until there was a war. And even after there was a war, 4 of those states, the border South states, never seceded. And 2/3 of white Southerners live in that upper South area. And furthermore, in the lower South, there is, I think, a majority against secession in Georgia, in Louisiana, and in Texas, and in some of the other states it's very close. So you can see that most Southerners do not see the case for secession. Here's why. The real question is is Lincoln going to be any menace to slavery? And the majority of Southerners simply cannot see how Lincoln is going to be any menace to slavery, and they think the real menace to slavery is going to come in secession and Civil War, which, if the South loses it, will abolish slavery faster than anything Lincoln can do in peacetime. And it is pointed out by the so-called Unionists, of which one of the greatest is your own Alexander Stephens, who ultimately becomes Vice President of the Confederacy and gives a spectacular Unionist speech in Milledgeville, Georgia, in November 15th, 1860. And my book on secession debated Georgia's showdown in 1860 features Alexander Stephens and the genius of his speech. And Stevens' point is this. Look, what can Lincoln do to us? He doesn't have a majority in Congress. He doesn't have a majority in the Supreme Court. And he pledges over and over again that he has no intention of abolishing slavery in the South, that all he wants to do is to stop slavery from expanding into new territories. And this is how far Lincoln goes in trying to reassure people that he has no intention of abolishing slavery, and it's a stunning trip that he takes. You all know that the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, passed in 1865, abolishes slavery in the South. But that is not the 13th Amendment that is proposed at the time that Lincoln is elected. The 13th Amendment proposed and passed by Congress in the few days before Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. This 13th Amendment declares that the federal government shall never abolish slavery. And that 13th Amendment is declared an unamendable constitutional amendment. And Lincoln endorses that 13th Amendment in his inaugural address. Now, wait a minute, say the Unionists. If he's willing to give us a constitutional amendment forever guaranteeing slavery, and that amendment is declared unamendable, that is to say, it'll never be amended, why is Lincoln any menace to us? What we need to do, if anything, is wait and see. And I've seen that word wait, W-A-I-T, in every Southern newspaper over and over and over again, always capitalized. Capital W, capital A, capital I, capital T. Wait. Wait and see if Lincoln is going to do anything to us. If he does anything to abolish slavery, then we can secede. But let's wait and see. And what Stevens proposes, and what becomes the answer to the secessionists, is let's have a Southern convention. Let's have a convention of all the Southern states, and let all the Southern states decide whether they are going to break up the Union or whether they are going to wait. And of course, the Unionists who don't want to secede have every reason to expect that a Southern convention will favor their design, because a majority of Southerners want to wait and see. So the notion of calling a Southern convention and letting a convention of all the South decide this question, rather than each individual state deciding this question, becomes the answer of Alexander Stephens and the answer of the Southern Unionists. And the determination of the secessionists, the minority in the South that wants to secede, is to make sure that that Southern convention never meets, and instead that each individual state decides this question, and particularly that the most secessionist state will go out first and present a fait accompli to the other states. And that becomes the great mechanism of secession. Don't let a Southern convention meet. Don't let the Southern majority ever decide about this question. Just let the one state that has a majority of secessionists act first and force a crisis on everybody else. The one state that obviously wants to secede and has the determination to carry this out is, of course, South Carolina. And the South Carolinians are rabid to secede. They have been rabid to secede ever since 1832. They tried to break up the Union in 1832 with the nullification controversy. They tried to break up the Union in 1850 after the Compromise of 1850. They tried to break up the Union after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They tried to break up the Union after John Brown's raid. They tried and tried and tried. And the only reason they failed was that they were scared to death. And they were scared to death because they weren't sure that once they seceded, any southern state would follow them. And if no southern state followed them, they would be left classically holding the bag and with no possibility of operating successfully. This had happened to them, as most of you know, in the nullification controversy of 1832, when South Carolina had acted and the whole rest of the South had said, now that's stupid, and amassed behind Andrew Jackson. And as a result, the South Carolinians had to cower and had to give up. And they were scared to death that the same thing would happen in 1860. They had the determination to secede. They were sure that secession made sense. But if nobody followed them out of the Union, they would be once again left holding the bag, and secession would be an empty gesture, and they would look foolish, and under no circumstances did they, as honorable gentlemen, want to have to cower again, and once again back down as they'd backed down in 1832. There gets to be a real fight in South Carolina, not about whether secession was a good idea, but about whether the South Carolinians dared push ahead with this and force a crisis on the rest of the South when they didn't have any assurance that any other southern state would follow them. A group of very radical South Carolinians, led by Robert Barnwell Rhett, was determined to secede and take their chances and hope that once they were out of the Union, the Southerners would not allow a Northern president to coerce them back into the Union. And as far as this radical minority was concerned, you had to force the rest of the South's hand. And they proposed, as soon as the South Carolina legislature meets, which is right after Lincoln's election, that an immediate secession convention be held and that South Carolina stop the possibility of any Southern convention from meeting and secede from the Union. That's what the, yeah. Thank you. I'm delighted we have a question.
Yeah, Robert led the efforts to secede. What was his last name?
Robert Barnwell Rhett.
Barnwell, okay.
Barnwell Rhett. His original name was Robert Barnwell Smith. But Robert Barnwell Smith thought that was much too Yankee a name, and he changed it to Robert Barnwell Rhett. And that change in name in itself tells you what this gentleman is all about. He wants no part of a South that has anything to do with Yankees or such Yankee names as Smith. And he wants a Southern nation to support South Carolina. And he's been working on this for 28 years. And he comes to the South Carolina legislature and he proposes an immediate secession convention. On November 9th, now this is 3 days after Lincoln is elected. On November 9th, the South Carolina legislature votes on Rhett's proposal for an immediate secession convention, and Rhett loses 44-1 in the state Senate. Those who are scared to death to secede without assurances from other states, and particularly assurances from their friends in Georgia, are in the saddle. And Rhett is desperate. And the other secessionists are desperate. It looks like South Carolina will not dare precipitate this event. A Southern convention might very well meet. A Southern convention means the Southern majority may get its way and wait and see, and South Carolina will be left fuming on the sidelines. On November 10th, 24 hours later, the South Carolina legislature unanimously decides, on the contrary, to hold an early secession convention. And this seems to me to be the decisive moment in the whole story. And a great deal of my research and a great deal of my thought has gone into trying to figure out what in the world happened between November 9th and November 10th to have South Carolina suddenly gain its nerve. And I felt during the process of trying to figure this out that my whole strategy of going back to the American Revolution and tracing these events that eventually would have caused secession had hit a terrible roadblock. That I could get to November 9th with all that steady progression of impersonal historical forces, but I couldn't get to November 10th. I couldn't get over that burden, yeah.
Were there certain power groups or cliques or interest groups, opinion makers or whatever, that were behind this change? In this gentleman that you mentioned,
Robert Barnwell Rhett.
Which forces did he and people like him represent?
Well, I haven't made clear yet how amazing this transformation is. It's not that one group changed their mind, it's that everybody changed their mind. In South Carolina, the South Carolina legislature unanimously, 24 hours after, rejecting secession and in effect delaying the crisis, and in my judgment there was a chance, though I can't say this for sure, a chance that the Civil War might not have occurred at that moment if that delaying action had triumphed. So this became, for me, an extremely important thing to try to figure out what happened between those dates. And what happened between those dates is fascinating and I think reveals the power of coincidence in human affairs. In 1854, the Charlestonians decided to build a railroad to Savannah, Georgia. Charleston was falling behind Savannah and wished to try to steal some of Savannah's commerce, and they decided to build a railroad to Savannah. The railroad, which is over 100 miles long, gets delayed by the Panic of 1857, as so many American enterprises did. On October 24th, 1860, on October 24th, 1860, that railroad is at last completed. It could have been completed on any day. It could have been completed in July. It could have been completed in January. It happened to be completed on October 24th, 1860. The Charlestonians decided to hold a celebration about their new railroad in Savannah. On November 2nd, 1860, they held a massive celebration in Savannah. And then at the time of that celebration, they said to the people in Savannah, Georgia, come on over to Charleston and let's celebrate in Charleston. And they set on November 2nd, the date of November 9th, 1860, to celebrate the railroad in Charleston. They could have set the date any time. They didn't know at that on November 2nd that secession was going to be in trouble on November 9th. They didn't know at that time that the state legislature would vote to delay secession on November 9th. They just happened to pick November 9th, 1860, the night after the South Carolina legislature had voted to delay secession, to celebrate the railroad in South Carolina. So on November 9th, 1860, and I have a great time telling this in my book. I just love this kind of thing. I love these kind of coincidences. I love the party they held because it was the most spectacular party ever held in Charleston to celebrate the railroad. They started out with shrimps and oysters and clams and mussels, and then they moved on to turtle soup with sherry, and then they moved on to duck and chicken and wild turkey. And then they moved on to drumfish and grouper. the great low country specialties. And then they moved on to steak and lamb, all the time with all kinds of wine flowing. And then they moved on to ice cream. And then they moved on to cake. This whole thing took 4 hours. And I have never seen such a party. And you can imagine for a narrative historian how much fun it is to write up this party. And then they get done with the party. And a couple of very shrewd Charlestonians pick a couple of very shrewd Georgians to go over after the party to Institute Hall, which is the great assembly hall in Charleston, and talk to a group of Charlestonians about secession. There are about 3,000 people in Institute Hall, and they are in despair because the South Carolina legislature has that day decided to delay, and they are in despair because it looks like no other state will follow South Carolina, and South Carolina has once again lost its nerve to secede. So they bring in these Georgians to Institute Hall, and particularly a Georgian named Francis Bartow. His name is unimportant to you, but he's an intriguing character to me. He's a resident of Savannah, a very wealthy man. He would ultimately become the first casualty of the Civil War, the first famous casualty of the Civil War at the Battle of Bull Run. And his funeral in Charleston on the way to his funeral in Savannah would be a spectacular affair. Francis Bartow is so interesting to me because he is the son-in-law of John Berrien, another man who's unimportant to you, but very important to me, because John Berrien is the greatest of the Whig nationalists in the Lower South. And he's been senator from from Georgia for many years, and his line has always been that the South is much better off in the nation, and it's a Southerner's duty to build up the nation in order so the nation can support slavery. His son-in-law is Francis Bartow, another big Whig nationalist who hates secession and who wants the South to stay in the Union and thinks that in the Union is the greatest chance to prosper. So Bartow gets up at a podium like this, and he says to this assembled crowd of South Carolinians, dying to secede but having no guts to do so because they don't know if anybody will follow them, please don't secede. Secession is madness. If you secede, you're going to get in a civil war. If you get in a civil war, you may lose that civil war. Wait and see. Be sensible. Be moderate for once. And if Lincoln turns out to be a danger, then we can secede. Please don't secede. And then he pauses, and he just stands there for what I take to have been 3 or 4 minutes and says nothing. And he just waits and waits. And then he says, but if you secede, I'm with you. And the crowd is stunned. And he says, how can we possibly have a nation of South Carolina on one side of the Savannah River and a nation of America with Georgia in it on the other side of the Savannah River? We'll just become another Italy with little nation states all over the place. If you secede, we have to secede and follow you, as stupid as the idea is, because we can't have the Savannah River dividing two nations. So once again he concludes, please don't secede. But if you secede, I'm with you. And there's a tremendous roar of approval from the people there. Hats are thrown towards this immense, this is a low ceiling, but the ceiling at Institute Hall is a great big ceiling. Hats are thrown towards the ceiling. People were screaming, and within 45 minutes, a telegram is sent to Columbia, where the South Carolina legislature is meeting, saying, Georgia has pledged to come to our support. And if that isn't enough, the Charlestonians hire a special train, and that train takes the Charlestonians to Columbia to tell them all over again the wondrous event that has happened, what Francis Bartow has said, and how secession is now safe. Georgians don't want us to do it, but if we do it, they pledge that they're going to follow us. And 3 hours after the train arrives in Columbia, the South Carolina legislature unanimously decides to hold a very early secession convention to meet on December 17th, long before a Southern convention can possibly assemble. Now, at this point, I have to be very careful because it's so easy to be misunderstood. I am not saying that if it hadn't been for the fact that a railroad was completed on a particular day, we never would have had a civil war in this country. I'm not even saying that we now wouldn't have not necessarily not had secession in 1860. What I am saying is that this starts the train of events which leads everywhere else. And that train of events becomes very difficult to stop once the South Carolinians decide to secede, which, as you all know, they do on December 20th, 1860, unanimously. And they are out of the Union. And the next question has always been, will the rest of the South follow us? Has Francis Bartow pledged in vain, or will the rest of the South come along? The decision in the rest of the Lower South is carried out in a very important atmosphere, which changes the whole issue. Changes the issue from, is it sensible to secede in the face of Lincoln's election, to, does the federal government have any right to coerce a state that has seceded? Once a state secedes, once a state has declared its right to secede, does the President of the United States have the right to use military force to coerce the state that has seceded back into the Union? And that issue becomes an issue before the rest of the South can even decide whether South Carolina was right to secede. Here's the way it comes about. The federal troops and I'm sure most of you know this, so let me go over it very briefly. The federal troops in Charleston Harbor are in Fort Moultrie, which is on the edge of Mount Pleasant, which is a Charleston suburb, and those troops are very vulnerable. In the center of Charleston Harbor is a fort called Fort Sumter, which has been built but never garrisoned, that is to say, never filled with troops. On December 26th, I like that date because it's my birthday, on December 26th, 1860, the federal troops move from Fort Moultrie, where they could easily be destroyed, to Fort Sumter, which would take quite a bombardment to get them out of there. And the issue becomes, in Washington, should the federal troops that have moved to Fort Sumter be reinforced before the South Carolinians can attack? The president is James Buchanan. I'm sure you've all heard, if you've studied this problem, that James Buchanan is one of our weakest and most vacillating presidents. I am convinced, on the contrary, that he's an extraordinarily decisive president at this point, and his decisiveness really matters. On December 29th, this is 3 days after these troops have moved over to Fort Sumter, Buchanan decides that he's going to send federal troops into the Charleston Harbor to reinforce Fort Sumter. And the word comes by telegram to Charleston that Buchanan intends to coerce us, and a coercing ship is coming. The commissioners, the South Carolina has 3 commissioners in Washington who hear about the ship coming, misunderstand. Buchanan is only going to reinforce that one fort in Charleston. They think he's going to reinforce every fort in the Lower South. And they send a telegram to Charleston saying, a coercing ship is coming to Charleston imminently. You must not allow the federal government to coerce us. And furthermore, those ships are going to every other Lower South fort, and you must alert the rest of the Lower South to stopping this horrible thing from happening. Telegram goes on to Joseph Brown in Georgia, in your state, Georgia. Joseph Brown telegrams the governors of Alabama and Louisiana. And the word, this, by the way, this is intriguing too. The first time a telegraph has really mattered in the course of American history. If it had taken 10 days to find out that this ship was coming, it would have been a different story. But they find it out like that. And that word goes around the South like that as a result of this new invention, the telegram. And that, too, is a coincidence, because a telegram could have been ready at any time. But it turns out to be ready at just this moment when it can make a big difference in alerting the southern states to what's going on. Well, I tell this story with great gusto in my book, too, because it's a great story. And the upshot of it is that all the Lower South governors seize the federal forts in their area before the electorate ever decides on secession. And what they say is, if the electorate should decide not to secede, well, we'll give the forts back. But until there's such a decision, we won't do that. And the issue becomes in Georgia and in Mississippi and in Alabama and in Louisiana not that very difficult issue. Should we wait to see if Lincoln is going to be any danger to slavery? But that very easy issue for most Southerners: should we stand behind our troops? Should we stand behind our boys? Our boys are risking their lives to capture these federal installations, and don't we have to stand behind them? And with the issue changing like this, it becomes much more possible to get a state like Georgia, which has been tending against secession, to secede. Robert Toombs, for example, in the Georgia legislature says, well, who are you people anyway, if you won't secede? Are you cowards? Are you disloyal to the state of Georgia? Are you unwilling to support your troops? Our troops are marching to conquer Fort Pulaski. They are risking their lives. Now you're going to vote against them and repudiate them? No way. You must stand behind our boys. Those of us who have lived through some wars hear that reverberation. That kind of talk always occurs in wars. Not is the war right, but will you stand behind your boys who are risking their lives? I think I will call it a tactic that George Bush is very fond of using. It's very much the same tactic the secessionists pull off. To make a long story short here, the Lower South decides to secede in the month of January. And by February 1st, not only South Carolina, but the states of Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi and Georgia and Texas are all out, and Georgia are all out of the Union. I've forgotten the state, but I forget which one I've forgotten, so I can't go back over the process. But it's 7 Lower South states that are out of the Union, and 8 Lower South and 8 Upper South states that are still saying wait and see. And they're still saying wait and see until Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th. And they are still saying wait and see on April 4th. You all know that the Fort Sumter incident, which actually starts the Civil War, occurs on April 9th and 10th. And on April 4th, less than a week before that occurs, the Virginia Secession Convention votes 2-1 against secession. They want to wait and see. But now the ball is switched to Lincoln's court. Lincoln has been inaugurated president on March 4th, and that's why when he gave that inaugural address saying that he would support the 13th Amendment, forever keeping slavery in the United States. By the way, I often, when I'm teaching this stuff, and I love to get my students involved in these kind of questions, I often ask them this question. If the South hadn't seceded, and that 13th Amendment had been passed, and you would have forever declared that the federal government could not abolish slavery, when do you think slavery would have been abolished? How long would it have taken to abolish slavery with no federal involvement allowed? In other words, how right were the Unionists in saying, let's wait and see? And I would say over the years, the consensus of my students, I don't know how the people in this room feel, was it would be until after the Second World War before slavery would have been abolished, when that whole series of events started that led to the Civil Rights Revolution. Yeah.
Actually, I have, I guess, more of a comment in regards to that as it relates to today. The question is, how long will it take to get a true democracy? Because, fathers of this country espouse, ideas, pursuit of happiness, so on and so forth, regardless because, again, stuff like that. So the question is, how long will it take, say because
that's a very good question. And would you mind if I added a second question, which you might think would be very good, which is, can the American people possibly have patience to wait for how long it's going to take? Because I don't know how you'd answer the question, but I would say it will take years to stabilize a democracy in Iraq. And I'm not at all convinced that the American people are willing to have our soldiers die for years. And that's really what Bush thinks. Bush thinks the country's running out of patience, and how do you possibly pursue a war when there's no patience? But there really are nice parallels between these situations. Yeah.
I'm a little confused. How do you reconcile this position of Lincoln, who has supported such an amendment, unlimited slavery, so any slavery that can be caused by the federal government, with his House divided speech, in which he said the Union cannot exist half slave, half free, permanently. It must be one or the other. But in his support of that amendment, which I have heard of, told us, he seems to be saying yes, it can. It seems to be a contradiction of his position.
That's a great question. And it illustrates one of the things that's most fun about this whole Civil War story, which is Lincoln. And trying to figure out Lincoln. And by the way, I'm going to write my next book on that subject. And after thousands of other people have written books on Lincoln, and so far as I'm concerned, no one has solved the mystery you're talking about, which is how can the man who issues the House divided speech turn around and support the 13th Amendment, forever protecting slavery? And my best answer, I'm not sure you're going to like this answer, but my best answer is Lincoln is perfectly willing for it to take 100 years to abolish slavery. He says that at one point. He says, if I have to wait 100 years to abolish slavery, that's all right. That's fine. And I think what Lincoln is hoping for is that southern states will slowly abolish slavery on their own, so that the federal government does not have to intervene. And he's willing to have that take a very long time. And I think it would have taken a very long time. This question epitomizes how difficult it is to call Lincoln a great emancipator until very late in the Civil War. Yeah.
So far what I'm learning, you're saying pretty much serendipity had a lot to do with the fact that South Carolina got support from Georgia, this guy named Bartow. So,
Francis Bartow.
Was it an economic incentive package or some kind of economic incentive? It was just serendipitous.
There were lots of reasons why South Carolina wanted to secede that had nothing to do with the railroad. There were lots of reasons why Francis Bartow thought it would be a disaster to have two nations spitting at each other across the Savannah River. And you couldn't possibly have had a civil war without those more fundamental forces pressing. But I think it could have possibly been delayed for several weeks, several months, a year or two. And that's really all peacemakers can do, is delay things. And hope that if you delay and delay and delay and delay, eventually there won't be a war. That's the best a peacemaker can ever do. And that's where the serendipity comes in. It's not that these forces pressing these two cultures towards war are going to end. They're going to continue, and there's going to be more and more crises. It's just that this is the moment it all exploded. And I think serendipity has something to do with why that moment became crucial. Yeah. By the way, this is all very controversial, and I'm sure I'm going to get attacked all over the place for this. And the whole question of how much contingency matters, how much these little things matter, is a great subject in historical inquiry these days. Yeah.
As opposed to this fortuitous circumstance, and what's the role of, let's say, certain vested class interests or certain are the people behind secession, are they the plank aristocracy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a very good question.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of forces, very fundamental forces of class interest, of racial interest, and so on, pressing these South Carolinians towards secession. But they're not going to get over the hump as long as they're scared to death. You have to have a class that is determined to secede. You have to have a class that thinks that Lincoln is dangerous in at least one state. But that class also has to be convinced that it's safe to do it. And these South Carolinians are very leery about that. And that's where the coincidence comes in. And without those big forces that you're talking about, those big class interests and big racial interests, of course there wouldn't be any secession. But I'm not convinced there would have been secession in December of 1860 if there had been a delay for a moment. Yeah.
What was Bartow's reaction to his response to this response to his speech? I mean, was he pleased with this, or did he?
Well, he thought he'd given. This is very much along the line you said. He thought he'd given in to the inevitable. He thought that there was no way that you're going to stop these crazy South Carolinians from eventually having a war. And that's another thing he says in his speech. I've lived with you guys for a week now. First in Savannah when we had our Savannah celebration, and now in Charleston when we have our Savannah. You guys are loony. You're crazy. And I know you're going to break up the Union, and I just as soon have you do it now as later, rather than having this thing hanging over our head for ever. And Bartow is very pleased. He doesn't see any possibility for a successful nation of America with these South Carolina crazies continually agitating. And he's a real nationalist. Here's an example of how much he's a nationalist. He raises a series of troops in Georgia to fight the Civil War. And Governor Joseph Brown says, give those troops to the state of Georgia. I want to enlist you in the Georgia Army. Bartow says, no way. I'm not going to enlist in the Georgia Army. I am a Southern Confederate. And my army is going to be the army of the Southern Confederacy. He's the only person in the whole South who's saying this. That's how much he's a nationalist, and that's how convinced he is that the nation of America has become untenable at this moment. So he is happy. He's happy and sad. Happy that this issue is at last being faced, but very leery about whether secession and civil war is going to be successful, which makes all the more touching the fact that his is the first funeral of this war. Yeah.
That's a question. South Carolina, I'm from South Carolina.
Congratulations. I bet you never knew you were from the center of the world, did you?
Yeah, I did.
Did you?
I learned, South Carolina supposedly plantation system was built off one of the islands down in Bermuda. One of the islands was built off of.
You mean Barbados?
Barbados.
Right.
They basically used the model from Barbados. Now, I guess my question, if that's true, assuming that's true, how much culture do they learn make them so much more niched in their, secession from the other state? Do you think that has something to do with the Barbados model that they built that South Carolina state on?
Superb question. And what you're saying is that you can't, and this is what I finally got through my thick skull about 37 years ago. You can't start in 1860 to explain all this. You've got to go way back in the history of South Carolina, including to the origins in Barbados, because it's a different class of people that came to South Carolina than came to Virginia. And they always were livid. And they always were avid, and they always were passionate. And that difference in South Carolina had always been there. Here's another example of that difference, which I'm sure you know about. Between 1803 and 1807, South Carolina reopens the African slave trade and imports 40,000 Africans. 1807 is the year when the United States government can finally end the African slave trade. South Carolina reopens the African slave trade. You can say, and I think it's right to say, that the American nation is built on 40,000 more Africans coming to this country enslaved through South Carolina. Nobody else does that. South Carolina has always been saying, we're different, we're more powerful, we're from Barbados, we're, this excellent point you made, a different kind of class that is determined to secede. There is never any question that the South Carolinians see themselves as different and are determined to do exactly what is eventually done. Use a minority to force the majority out of the Union. The only question, ever since 1832, is do they have the guts to do it? Do they have the fortitude to do it? And that's what finally gets worked out in the secession crisis. Let me, lest I leave you hanging, let me finish the tale, and then we can have some more questions. We still got the Upper South in the Union. And Lincoln knows, and Jefferson Davis knows, that if you have only the Lower South out of the Union and the Upper South stays in the Union, this new Confederacy is going to have a very difficult time winning a Civil War. So it becomes very crucial what happens to the Upper South. Lincoln thinks that you absolutely have to do something about this situation in Fort Sumter. Lincoln's reasoning is that you can't have a democracy if, after the winners make their decision at the polls, the losers leave. What kind of majority, what kind of democracy is that if you have a decision at the ballot box and those who lose at the ballot box depart? Lincoln feels the very future of democracy is at stake in stopping this secession movement. On the other hand, he's scared to death that if he sends a warship into Charleston Harbor the way James Buchanan did, he's going to start something that's going to get out of hand. So what he does, as most of you already know, is one of the cleverest acts of any politician. And one thing you have to say about Lincoln is no matter how many times you wonder about his philosophy and how he squares the House divided with the 13th Amendment and all that, he is the shrewdest politician we have ever had in the White House. And nowhere was he more shrewd than with this Fort Sumter thing. He sends a telegram, he sends a messenger to the South Carolina governor saying that he is about to send a ship to Fort Sumter bearing food for hungry men. Food for hungry men. And as long as the Confederacy doesn't fire on on that ship, he will just land food for hungry men. But, says he, if they dare fire on my ship, then I'll land troops in Fort Sumter. So Jefferson Davis gets this communique from Lincoln. He holds a cabinet meeting. Robert Toombs of your great state of Georgia is the only person in Davis's cabinet who says, wait a minute, I don't think we better fire on that ship. Instead, these hot-headed Confederates decide we're not going to let Lincoln send his food for hungry men into our own port, and the Charlestonians and the Southern Confederacy reduces Fort Sumter on April 9th and 10th. And then the question becomes, will the Upper South secede? And the question for them, as it was earlier for the Lower South, was, do we allow this coercion of Southern boys to come back into the Union, the coercion that Lincoln is now progressing. And it's again Virginia that is crucial, because Virginia is the only state that has a secession convention operating. And the delayers in Virginia have not given up yet. And they hold vote after vote after Fort Sumter, after there's these explosions, in which they decide to wait and see, to wait and see, to wait and see, and then Lincoln does what I think is the final and climactic act. He issues a presidential proclamation on April 15th, calling up 75,000 men to put down the rebellion in Charleston Harbor. Or in other words, he is calling up South Carolinians to murder Virginians, calling up men from all over the South to fight Southerners in a civil war. At this point, while Virginians are still trying to stall, there's a marvelous character who I talk about a lot in my book named Henry Wise, who's ex-governor of Virginia, has been governor during John Brown's raid, and it was given up his office 3 or 4 days earlier. And Wise decides he's had enough, and he is going to make sure that Virginia secedes. And on his own authority, he's the ex-governor. On his own authority, he arranges to have troops conquer Harper's Ferry in Virginia and the Gosport Naval Yards in Norfolk. And he sends troops silently to those troops, to that area. And then he gets up in the Virginia Convention. And he says to the assembled multitude, all right, I have ordered Virginia troops to take these federal installations from the federal government. And he pulls out a great, this is unfortunately not a great big pocket watch, but he pulls out a great big pocket watch and he says, at this hour, your boys are marching to conquer those installations. And then he pulls out from his pocket a great big horse pistol. You'll have to imagine that this is a horse pistol. And says that your boys are grabbing rifles, rifles meant to kill Southerners. And if you want to stay in the Union, if you want to repudiate your boys who are marching, you're going to have to assassinate me first. And he pushes this, he rolls around with this horse pistol and dares somebody to come up and assassinate him. And 45 minutes later, the Virginia Convention votes to secede. Eventually, all the so-called Middle South states vote to secede. All the border Souths don't vote to secede. And a third of the Southerners never secede. And that third of the Southerners supplies 350,000 men to the Union Army. More men that are killed in the whole of the Civil War. For every Union man that dies, a Southern boy volunteers for the Union Army. That's how difficult it was to get secession. There were lots of people who never could see the case for doing anything but wait and see. But that minority had gotten its way, and through the process of first seceding, then having military crisis after military crisis, the majority of Southerners were out of the Union, and we had a passionate Civil War in our hands. And thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience.